Borders have always changed because of war, diplomatic pacts, or by countries straight up buying the land. Even though the U.S. borders have been consistent throughout most of its history, in the case of one unassuming stretch of land in the South, a sudden shifting in the borderlines led to a surprising change of nationality. Back in the year 1906, the American Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company endeavored to dig a new channel that would redirect the Rio Grande River in an effort to prevent flooding of property owned by the company. The intention was to create an oxbow lake that would divert the current around one of their own pumping stations. The channel would not work out as they anticipated, but that would become the least of their problems. During this process, the company neglected to place boundary markers along the original path of the river, and in doing so caused a region directly south of the new course of the Rio Grande to be perceived as part of Mexico rather than the U.S. The corner cutting of the irrigation company was not overlooked by the authorities and would soon find itself paying out far more than what it would have taken to properly mark the boundaries for the project. Landowners on both sides of the Mexican-American border took the company to court for the unauthorized usage of their property, where it was fined and charged to repay the damages. The border markers that would have prevented this issue would have cost around $200, while the amount the company was forced to pay out in the end was well over $10,000. Needless to say, the company likely regretted not taking the proper precautions. Perhaps it was foolish to think that literally moving rivers, like the powerful demigods of Greek myth, wouldn't have lasting consequences. The forces of nature have a way of making even the most ambitious of irrigation projects seem insignificant with time, though the damage done by the company was persistent enough at the time for the courts to curtail efforts to fix it. When it was found by the authorities that the environmental impact of changing the river's course was not feasibly reversible, it was decided that the body of water should not be irrigated any further in interest of leaving the matter resolved. Left unattended, the American Rio Grande and Land Irrigation Company's interest turned elsewhere. The Oxbow Lake dried up and left a conspicuous stretch of land that would prove to have an eventful future. The overall controversial and rushed nature of the irrigation project left several misconceptions in its wake, including the incorrect assumption that the 413-acre tract of land had never been a part of the United States. It would go on to be named the Horcon Tract, with all geopolitical traces of where the river once ran through it gradually erased by time. The legal precedent for borders at the time declared that the man-made alterations to the course of the rivers meant that no changes to the pre-existing borders should take place. No exception was made in this case, and although the law stated that there was now at least a bit of American territory south of the Rio Grande, the public and the courts didn't enforce the decision. As the course case faded from relevance and natural weather and seasonal flooding continued to affect the Rio Grande River, the status of the Horcon Tract was all but forgotten. Because the Rio Grande for some time had been the definitive natural landmark of the southern border of the United States, nobody questioned the validity of the claims that the land belonged to Mexico. The people who settled within the region never claimed heritage from the U.S., instead living under Mexican culture and law. Flash forward to the Roaring '20s, and the so-called Mexican village of Rio Rico is sitting comfortably on what is still American land, with its population still fully believing that the settlement in the Horcon Tract was actually not in the United States at all. As a matter of fact, the people used Mexican currency and accepted the governance of the nation of Mexico as any other city south of the Rio Grande did at the time. But by the time Rio Rico had sprung up, the Horcon Tract had developed a distinctive culture, owing its proximity to both the Gulf of Mexico and the rest of the United States. Rio Rico was directly in the center of it and quickly rose to prominence as a boomtown, attracting drifters from both sides of the border to experience a wealth of dubiously legal pleasures. Prohibition was in full effect across the United States in the 1920s, but from the perspective of Rio Rico, no such ban would affect a village that was south of the American border. Technically, the village was not exempt from the policy, but in practice, Rio Rico was a prime destination for leisure drinking, and there was plenty of beer and tequila to go around. Those who lived north of the river, where prohibition was enforced more diligently, could travel across a suspension bridge and find themselves in a place where they were able to drink as much as they wished, while never even truly leaving the United States. Drinking wasn't the only vice that this lax approach to American law allowed to happen in Rio Rico, as gambling was an enormously popular pastime in the town. Visitors could come to Rio Rico and place bets on cockfights and greyhound races, all the while enjoying a constant supply of BOOZE. Casinos operated legally all throughout Rio Rico, along with salacious nightclubs and bordellos. There was also a famous social club known as the Tivoli Café, which boasted of having the best and largest dance floor in the entire Rio Grande Valley. The incredible variety of seedy delights made the business owners of Rio Rico very wealthy, and the town became a popular resort destination for many years to come. The smuggling of alcohol back across the American border was also a part of the appeal of Rio Rico, and early airplanes were used to carry tequila from the Horcon Tract and other parts of the Rio Grande back to the United States. Legends of the debauchery and vice that went down in Rio Rico persist to this day, but none were more prominent than the stories of how notorious gangster Al Capone would party there. There's no official record of the scar-faced crime boss being physically present in Rio Rico, but his organization was believed to have funneled money into a resort in the area in an effort to increase its success. Several buildings throughout the town are believed to have been constructed on the orders of the Chicago outfit, with one in particular being notably fortified against possible mob or police violence. This rumored Al Capone house was located on the other side of the Rio Grande in West Laco and was the center of much speculation about the mafioso's involvement within the area. A 5-peso note signed with Al Capone's name was even found in possession of a Mexican army general by the name of Pancho Villa in 1923. General Villa also marked the note with his own signature, raising the value and uniqueness of those 5 pesos even more. Circumstantial evidence like this does make it seem more likely that Al Capone spent time in Rio Rico, and a man as wanted by the authorities as him wouldn't leave his name on any official registry if it meant he could be found out. It would also make sense for such a powerful kingpin to see the utility in a place like Rio Rico, as it was a safe haven for all illegal activity of all kinds and was easily accessible from the southern United States. The mythology of Al Capone becoming intertwined with Rio Rico is only natural, and the fact that a mafioso of such renown was celebrated in the local culture says a lot about how the people of Rio Rico saw themselves. There had to be a sort of shameless joy in the association with the American government's public enemy number one, but we may never know the true extent of the connection. Perhaps, as it's often said about another famous American gambling town, what happens in Rio Rico stays in Rio Rico. What didn't stay in Rio Rico was the money that the Prohibition era brought in, because not long after the ban on alcohol was lifted, the flow of wealth into the Horcon Tract slowed down substantially. The resort town had lost the forbidden allure that had been its calling card over the course of the last few decades, and became a more tranquil, if less in-demand community. The wheel of history had moved on, with the Great Depression bringing economic struggle to the entire country. Rio Rico would remain out of the national spotlight until 1967, when the truth of the village's national jurisdiction was revealed. James Hill Jr., a research professor at Arizona State University, was the one who made the discovery after over half a century. Compiling a series of regional maps from throughout history and analyzing them thoroughly, Professor Hill was able to deduce how the Horcon Tract came to be. His findings would prove definitively that Rio Rico was the only American settlement south of the Rio Grande. The American Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company had long since been bought out and reformed into another company, but the full effect of its unsanctioned actions back at the beginning of the century had come to light. The border had, by all legal definitions, never been moved further north. Even the digging of another channel to reroute the Rio Grande couldn't meaningfully address the discrepancy, as the law against man-made rivers altering borders was still very much in effect. These days, it seems impossible that one small company could affect the fate of such a powerful nation, and in truth, it wasn't very plausible even at the time. Rio Rico was now in an unusual position, as since it had been founded, the people who inhabited the town had thought for generations that they were all natural-born Mexican citizens. The legal proof that this had never been the case probably made all that scum and villainy that occurred in the 1920s seem a bit silly in retrospect. When it comes to the legality of all things in society, people can really only operate with the knowledge they're given. All the pastimes that were considered vices by the United States government, but were perfectly legal under Mexican law, had to stand as mere facts of how things were done back then in Rio Rico. The rampant crime of Rio Rico in its heyday could effectively go unpunished. Much like the course of the river that was forever changed by the actions of the American Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company, there was little that could be done now that the time for swift law enforcement had passed. But now, several decades after the height of the town's economic boom, there was a much more pressing legal issue that needed to be resolved: the question of individual citizenship. If the people of Rio Rico were born on what was legally American soil, did it then legally follow that they were in fact American citizens? This seemingly simple question was at the center of several legal cases involving supposed immigration from the Horcon Tract into the rest of America. The next 10 years were a storm of activity for those born in Rio Rico, as the Public Appeals Court would have to make a ruling one way or another on the subject. For For some who had crossed the border illegally from Mexico, the difference between an affirmative granting of citizenship and a denial of it could mean deportation. On the other hand, definitive proof that an individual had been born in Rio Rico was an effective defense for a lawyer trying to grant a client permanent United States citizenship. One such case was that of a man named Romero Cantu, who was allowed to stay in the United States thanks to the efforts of his legal representative, Laurier McDonald. By citing Romero Cantu's record of birth, McDonald successfully proved that his client was an American citizen due to being born in Rio Rico. The resolution of this case would prove to be a landmark in the court decisions to follow. Soon, anyone who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. would say they were born in Rio Rico. According to some sources, these statements weren't even limited to those born in the area or even Mexican nationals. Would-be immigrants from all parts of Europe and Asia, going as far as China, would make statements about hailing from that small village in the Rio Grande Valley. The borders of the Horcon Tract were scrutinized heavily in the coming years so that only the most clear-cut of claims would be admitted in court. It was a confusing and unprecedented legal struggle that once again radically changed Rio Rico's relationship to its own culture. There could hardly be a clearer example of the ambiguous nature of the borders than the matter of determining what the people of Rio Rico could really call their homeland. When the Board of Immigration Appeals declared that residents of Rio Rico could claim U.S. citizenship because of birthright, the village once again exploded with activity. But unlike during the 1920s, the focus of this hustle and bustle was not the town itself, but rather what a legitimate background in Rio Rico could mean for those who could rightfully claim it. Those with the desire to move north made their claims, and several more who were not truly born in the area moved in with the hopes of finding a plausible method of being accepted into America. Over many years, thousands of Mexican residents traveled to Rio Rico for this very purpose. With so many requests for immigration coming in from south of the Rio Grande, the Horcon Tract became a bottleneck of activity. By the ruling of the American courts, only those individuals who had been born in the Horcon Tract between 1906 and 1972 were eligible for U.S. citizenship. Many people leaped at the chance to pursue a new life in America and packed up and left Rio Rico for greater opportunities. With so many families now granted full access to an entirely new and thriving homeland, it was hard to imagine many of them would stay put in the Horcon Tract, especially with the sinking feeling that this could all be temporary. The window for gaining citizenship through this claim of birthright was closing, and it was better to get safely over the border and begin a new life before the opportunity was revoked. The United States government accepted over 200 people from Rio Rico and the surrounding Horcon Tract into the country, but could only extend its generosity so far. To the lawmakers, this strip of land was only American as a technicality, the result of a mistake made by an errant irrigation company. In their eyes, this mistake would have to be fixed so that America's southern border in Texas would once again stop at the Rio Grande. Thus, the Boundary Treaty of 1970 was ratified, a document designed to give over the Horcon Tract to the Mexican government. Rio Rico would officially become a Mexican town, as its residents for the longest time believed it was, but only after some decisive flood control was implemented through the area. Mexico and the United States worked together to ensure these projects reached completion in a timely manner, splitting the cost of the project. The process was completed by 1977, at which point Rio Rico and Horcon Tract were legally no longer considered part of America. Historically, this treaty would mark the only instance the United States would willingly give territory over to a foreign nation. Rio Rico's population dwindled as its community was split following this law going into effect. Most of those who expected to get over the border legally were disappointed and returned home to other parts of Mexico. Those who crossed into America generally stayed there and raised the next generations of their family in the U.S. It must have been a surreal thing for those families who lived in Rio Rico to find out that the culture they were born into and raised in was actually that of a foreign country, Mexico. It's quite likely that many of those who moved to other parts of the U.S. before Rio Rico was annexed into Mexico never actually set foot on Mexican soil for their entire lives. The once thriving community, known for its theaters and dance halls, became less and less of a tourist destination, and in today's world, Rio Rico stands as little more than a tiny village on the Mexican-American border. While Rio Rico is still inhabited by a number of families, the local economy is merely a puff of smoke compared to the town's uproarious origins. The only source of wealth in the modern day of the Horcon Tract comes from small-scale farming among the residents. That isn't to say that there haven't been other American and Mexican territories that have fluctuated in which side of the border they found themselves on. To this day, the Rio Grande River has continued to mark the border for a fair length of its run, as recognized by both the United States and Mexican government. By the very nature of it being a river, the Rio Grande is subject to the whims of the elements. Between the years of 1989 and 2009, it was discovered the river had changed course several times and left parts of northern Mexico and southern Texas on opposite sides from where they were previously. In these cases, the nationality of these settlements wasn't changed, and all 128 of these locations were effectively grandfathered in as parts of their respective countries. Similar to the Horcon Tract prior to the land drying up, the vast majority of these territories are located along the meanders of the river contained within Oxbow Lakes. These locations have been referred to as bancos. In any case, the biggest difference between Rio Rico and the bancos was that only in the case of Rio Rico did a community grow completely oblivious to the truth of which country it was located in. It will always be known as the town that forgot it was American, a unique fixture in the history of two different countries. There are still people who pass through Rio Rico in the hopes of crossing the border into the US, but given how much surveillance has increased along the entirety of the southern edge of the US, the danger of crossing the Rio Grande in the modern day might often outweigh the novelty of doing so from old Rio Rico. Now watch what countries would look like after World War III, or check out why the UK is doomed after Brexit.